Hi, I'm Chad with Move Forward Guitar. This lesson is from our course Music Theory 1. All the lessons for this course are free on our YouTube channel, so you can follow right along with the playlist, or you can look in the description below for links to the rest of the lessons. To accelerate your learning though, I highly recommend that you download the corresponding workbook and e-guide. To learn more about the workbook and e-guide, click the link on the screen or look in the description below. Welcome to Music Theory 1, Lesson 1. In this lesson, I'm going to explain the musical alphabet. So when you're learning music theory for guitar, I think the best place to start is with the musical alphabet. And all the musical alphabet is all the notes in music. And in Western music, there's only 12 notes. And each of those notes is represented by a letter name. And all a note is what you hear when you strike a string on your guitar, or if you're to hit a key on the piano, or play any other instrument that produces notes, unlike a percussion type instrument. But since we're talking about guitar, we'll stick with guitar, and here's some examples of notes. And you hear notes at different pitches, meaning they're either higher or lower. And there can be two notes with the exact same name. For example, there could be a note called A that is a lower pitch than another note with the exact same note name of A that's a higher pitch. And those are called octaves, but we'll talk about that in a later lesson. But that's why you have so many notes on your fretboard that you can play. But all those notes are represented by only 12 letter names. And if you know the English alphabet, the musical alphabet is really easy to learn because the musical alphabet follows right along with the English alphabet in the same order with the same letter names, but there's only 12 notes in the musical alphabet, like I said, so that means that there are less letter names in the musical alphabet than there are in the English alphabet. And the English alphabet is just made up of letter names. Like on your screen, there's 26 letter names, and those are the building blocks for reading and writing, understanding language better. And that's pretty much what the musical alphabet is to music. It's the building blocks for playing and expressing yourself and understanding music better. And like I said, if you have the English alphabet memorized, you pretty much have the musical alphabet memorized because it follows right along with the same letter names, but there's less of them. And the letter names of the musical alphabet are only A through G. So these are the only notes you're ever going to see in music. There's no H, there's no K, there's no N, or any of that. You're never going to see any notes other than represented by the letter names A through G. So that means the musical alphabet is just the English alphabet follows right along with it, but it stops at G, and then after G it starts over at A again, and then those letter names just repeat over and over. And you may be wondering why there's only 7 letter names represented right here when I told you that Western music was made up of 12 notes. And that's because these are what are called the natural notes. And natural notes mean that there's no sharps or flats added to the notes. But even though there's 12 notes, these are still the only letter names that you have to memorize for the musical alphabet. Because sharps and flats, which look like this in the gray for each of these, still have the same letter names. For example, this is called an A sharp, this is called a B flat, this is called a C sharp, this is called a D flat. So this is your sharp symbol and this is your flat symbol. So now you have all 12 notes of the musical alphabet represented right here. And if you count them up, that equals 12. And you can see there's the 7 natural notes, and then you have the 5 sharps and flats, but they're still represented by the same letter names. And if you visualize a piano, the natural notes are all your white keys. So all the white keys are your natural notes, and the sharps and flats are your black keys. So that's how you can visualize it. And we're going to talk a lot about sharps and flats and everything, but for now just realize that a sharp is when you raise a note, so you can think about taking an A and raising it to a sharp, and a flat is when you lower a note, so you could think about, for example, here taking this B and lowering it, so that would be B flat. So if you took a note, for example, A, raised it, it could become A sharp. If you took a note like B, lowered it, it could become B flat. But again, don't worry too much about that for now. We'll talk more about that in upcoming lessons. Also, you may be wondering why these notes are stacked on top of each other when these natural notes aren't. They share their own space. Just like if you're looking at a piano, the natural notes just share their own key, but the sharps and flats are sharing black keys. For example, right here you have an A sharp and a B flat represented by this one black key. And those are what are known as enharmonic equivalents. So that means an A sharp and a B flat are the exact same note. So if you were to strike this key on a piano, it's going to sound the same no matter how you do it or what you call it, whether you call it A sharp or B flat, it's going to sound the exact same to your ears, but they're represented by different names. So an enharmonic note is a note that's the same pitch but a different name. And we're not going to dive into why that is now, that'll just be too confusing, but it just has to do with the musical situations you're in as to what you would call that. We'll dive into that really deep as we go through these lessons. But for now, just realize that anytime there's a sharp, there's also a flat, or anytime there's a flat, there's also a sharp. That is the same pitch. So a C sharp and a D flat are the exact same pitch, they just have different note names, and that's determined by the musical situation as to which one you would call it. But the natural notes only have one name, so this key right here represents an A note. There's no other name that you would call this when you're just talking about basic theory. There's times when, for example, this could be called something else, but don't worry about that, we'll deal with that later. For now, just know that the natural notes are A through G with no sharp and flat on them, and then the sharps and flats are the same letter names. They just are represented with a sharp or flat after them. And every time there's a sharp, it could also be a flat, just depending on the musical situation. So A sharp could also be B flat. So since we're talking about music theory for guitar, let's look at this on a fretboard diagram. And just to make sure that you understand what you're looking at, this is your sixth string, this is your first string. So if you're holding your guitar, you'd be looking down right here. So this is your lowest string, your thickest string, this is your highest string. These vertical lines represent your fret wires, and then in between are what are called your frets. And we'll talk more about that as we go through the lessons. Hopefully you already realize that if you're taking the music theory lesson. If not, you could take our beginner courses and I go through all that. But I'll talk a little bit about it as we go through these lessons as well. But just realize that this, where all these notes are written right here, these black dots with the letter names in them represent notes that you would fret on your fretboard. For example, if I push my string down right here in this fret and played that string, it would make an A note. And what I'm showing right here is your sixth string, so your thickest string, which would be closest to your face if you're holding your guitar. And that's just how fretboard diagrams are laid out. It can seem a little funny if you're not used to it, but this is what they're going to look like as we go through this course. So since we're talking about guitar, we're looking at a fretboard diagram, and these are all your natural notes, the musical alphabet. It just started over on A again after G. And then in between most of your natural notes, you have a sharp or a flat. So in between A and B, you have an A sharp or a B flat, which is whether you raise A up or lower the B down. If you raise the A up, that's an A sharp. If you lower the B down, that's a B flat, but don't worry too much about that for now. In between C and D is C sharp and D flat, and so on. And these are all the notes in music, all the notes you're going to find on your fretboard. And now obviously you have a bunch of blank space on your fretboard, and that's just because all those notes are repeated. So I have what I just showed you right here, which is A through G. It happens again right here, A through G, actually through G sharp when you're talking about sharps and flats. And if you look, you're not going to find any letter name that isn't in A, B, C, D, E, F, or G. There's nothing that's H, I, J, K, or anything like that. It's either a natural note with no sharp or flat after it, or it's the same letter name with a sharp or flat after it. Now, a lot of these notes are different pitches, like I mentioned. For example, this note and this note are the same note name, but they're a different pitch. This note right here is actually higher in pitch, meaning it would sound higher if you struck your string, but it's the same note name. And we'll really dive into that, but just realize that all the notes in music are A through G, no matter what instrument you play. And then one thing I didn't mention, which you might be wondering about, is that in between B and C and E and F, there's no sharp or flat. So there's a sharp or a flat in between every single note except B and C and E and F. And if you look at a piano again, that's really easy to visualize, because between B and C and E and F, there's no black key. So between everything else, there's a black key, which is a sharp or a flat. So after A, the next note would be this black key, which is A sharp or B flat. But after B, you can see there's no black key. If you look at any piano, it's that way. that means that in between B and C or E and F, same thing, there's no sharp or flat. So if we look at all the notes on the guitar, again, any place you would see a B and C or an E and F, no matter where on the guitar, there's not going to be a sharp or flat in between them. It doesn't matter where you find them on the guitar or on any instrument. And don't worry too much about why that is right now, just know that that's what it is. That in between B and C and E and F, there's no sharp and flat. In between all the other notes, you end up with a sharp or a flat. But they share the same letter names as the notes that they're in between. And then one thing I just want to mention really quick in this lesson is that anytime you start on one note, for example, we were starting on A when I was representing the musical alphabet, and you go along on one string to that next note. You can do it on multiple strings, but it's easier to visualize on one string for now. If I was to play each of these notes from A to A, that would be called an achromatic scale because I'm playing all of the notes that I possibly can from A to A. Or it'd be the same whether I did it from any other note. If I did it from C to C and I played all the notes in between, that would be a C chromatic scale. So just be aware that the chromatic scale uses all the notes in music, so it just follows right along with the musical alphabet, just depending what note you start on is the note that it's called. So if I started on E and played E, that'd be an E chromatic scale. And don't worry too much about that for now. We're going to talk more about scales later, but it is something you'll hear, so just be aware of that. So that's an explanation of the musical alphabet. In the next lesson, I'm going to talk about the layout of the fretboard. Look in the Music Theory 1 workbook for step-by-step guidance on how to retain this information and what to do next. And remember, all the charts and diagrams are in the Music Theory 1 e-guide for you to reference anytime.